Inside one of Chicago's most polished coffee shops, a well-dressed financial director publicly humiliated a simply dressed single father in front of the entire room. He called the man useless, threatened to have his daughter removed from his custody, then waved in two large associates and ordered the father to get on his knees and apologize. The whole cafe watched in silence, certain of how this would end. Then, in the space of a few seconds, all three men were on the floor. Nobody laughed after that. The question nobody could answer was simple: who exactly was this man? The cafe was called Meridian, and it sat on the corner of Michigan Avenue, like it had always been there and always intended to stay. The interior was warm, walnut, and brushed brass, the kind of place where the espresso cost more than a full meal somewhere else, and nobody thought twice about it. The lighting was low and deliberate, even in the morning, the kind that made everyone look slightly more composed than they actually were. By 8 in the morning, every seat was occupied. Lawyers scrolling through briefs on tablets, two women in finance splitting a croissant and talking without looking at each other, a young couple near the window pretending to read while actually watching everyone else. It was a room full of people performing a version of themselves they wanted the city to see, and the city, as always, played along. Hayes Gallagher walked in just after 8, holding the door open long enough for his daughter Lily to step through before him. He was wearing dark work pants and a gray pullover, clean but unremarkable. The kind of clothes a man chooses when getting dressed is a task to complete, not a statement to make. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, lean through the shoulders in a way that his loose clothing mostly concealed, with the kind of stillness in his face that people sometimes mistook for blankness, but was something else entirely. His eyes moved across the room once the way a person does when they're used to entering spaces and needing to understand them quickly, not anxiously, not obviously just a single pass that cataloged exits, occupants, and sightlines before he had taken 3 steps inside. Then he guided Lily toward a small table near the back wall, away from the foot traffic, away from the door. He ordered a black coffee and a hot chocolate, exchanged a few quiet words with the server, and settled into his seat. Lily sat across from him with her backpack on her lap, both hands wrapped around the warm cup, when it arrived the way anyone does on a cold Chicago morning when the heat of the ceramic is the first good thing the day has offered. Hayes watched her for a moment, the particular kind of watching a parent does when the world around them has temporarily gone quiet, and the only thing worth looking at is right in front of them. And then he turned to look out the window at the street, where the morning was already moving fast. This was their Tuesday routine. Before school, before the construction site, where Hayes worked as a project coordinator, before the day asked anything from either of them. 30 minutes at Meridian, usually quiet, usually unremarkable. He had learned in the years since his wife died that routine was not the enemy of grief. It was the architecture you built around it, so it didn't collapse everything else. The coffee was good. The corner table was reliable. And for 30 minutes on Tuesday mornings, the city left them alone. Across the cafe in a corner booth with a clear sight line to the entire room, a woman sat alone with a flat white and no phone in her hand. This was unusual enough that a few people had glanced at her twice. She was in her early 40s, dressed in a charcoal blazer over a silk blouse the color of cream, and she wore no jewelry except a single watch that, if you knew what to look for, cost more than most people's cars. Her name was Audrey Sinclair, and she was the kind of person who could walk into a room like Meridian and go almost unnoticed, not because she was forgettable, but because she had spent 20 years learning how to make herself look like she belonged to whatever room she was in without revealing anything about where she actually stood. Audrey was in Chicago for a deal that had not been announced yet. In 72 hours, her conglomerate Sinclair Capital Group, a privately held investment firm managing assets in excess of $40 billion, would complete its acquisition of Apex Equities, a mid-sized financial services firm whose leadership had no idea the terms had already been finalized. She was not supposed to be at Meridian. She had a breakfast meeting at 8:30 in a private dining room 7 blocks north, but she had arrived in the city the night before with 2 hours to herself, and she had spent decades building the habit of walking into ordinary places and simply watching how people behaved when nobody important was looking. It told her things about a city that no financial report ever could. The way a barista handled a difficult customer, the way strangers navigated a shared space when they thought nobody of consequence was paying attention. These were the details that didn't appear in quarterly filings, but told you everything about the character of a place. She had noticed Hayes when he walked in. Not with particular interest at first, just the automatic inventory she ran on every person who entered a space she occupied. But something had made her look again. It was the way he'd moved through the room. Not hurried, not self-conscious, not performing anything. He'd assessed the space and chosen a position that put his back to the wall and gave him a view of the door without making it obvious he was doing either. He'd exchanged exactly the right number of words with the server, enough to be pleasant, not enough to invite conversation. And then he'd settled in with the particular quality of stillness that Audrey associated with people who had learned at some point, and in some environment, that required it, how to be invisible in a room while remaining completely aware of everything happening inside it. Most people would never register that as deliberate. Audrey registered it immediately. She looked at his clothes, his posture, the unhurried way he'd spoken to the server, the way he kept one hand resting flat on the table, relaxed but available. She had spent enough time around certain kinds of men to know that the ones who moved like this were not accountants or construction managers regardless of what their work badge said. She filed the observation away and returned to her coffee, turning it over in the back of her mind, the way she turned over numbers that didn't quite add up, but hadn't yet revealed what they were missing. The cafe went on around them, the low percussion of cups on saucers, the hiss of the espresso machine conversations overlapping into an even neutral hum. Hayes was telling Lily something about the walk to school, his voice low and unhurried when the door opened again and Preston Mercer came in. Preston was the kind of man who entered rooms loudly even when he was trying to be quiet, which he was never trying to be. He was 46, broad-shouldered, and thick in the way of someone who had once been athletic and now only maintained the silhouette of it. He wore a navy suit that was expensive without being tasteful cufflinks that caught the light every time he moved his wrist, and the expression of a person who had spent so long being deferred to that. He had forgotten it was ever a choice anyone made. He was on his phone before the door had closed behind him, voice carrying across half the cafe, without apparent awareness or concern. "I know, tell Marcus the terms aren't flexible. We're not renegotiating the covenant structure at this stage." He moved through the cafe toward the counter, one hand gesturing as he spoke, navigating the space with the particular carelessness of someone who had decided other people would move for him. "If he can't work with what we sent over, he can take it to arbitration. I don't care." He reached the counter and caught the eye of the barista with a single raised finger, not a wave, not a nod, just the gesture of a man accustomed to being recognized and served quickly. He ordered without looking at the menu, the same order he presumably gave every morning in every cafe that had the misfortune of being convenient to wherever he needed to be. Then he turned back to his call, stepping slightly sideways without checking where he was stepping, and his elbow caught the tall paper cup sitting on the edge of the small tray at Hayes's table. The cup went over. Coffee spread fast across the table and ran over the edge before Hayes could do more than push back from the spill. It wasn't scalding. At that point, the cup had been sitting for a few minutes, but it covered most of the table and soaked into the paper bag where Lily's muffin had been. Hayes moved Lily's things out of the way first, automatically the reflex of a parent, and then reached for the napkins in the holder at the edge of the table and began clearing the spill, moving with the contained efficiency of a man who had been through worse and understood the cost of reacting before you needed to. Preston ended his call. He looked at the table, looked at Hayes, and the expression on his face was not embarrassment. It was closer to mild annoyance at the inconvenience of having to address the situation at all, the expression of a man who has just encountered a minor logistical problem that he expects someone else to resolve. "You had that sitting right on the edge," Preston said. His tone was the tone of a man delivering a fair assessment, one professional to another, explaining where the fault lay. Hayes set the soaked napkins down. "It was on the table," he said. "You weren't watching where you were going." The words were even not aggressive, the way a man speaks when he's choosing each one carefully and has decided that accuracy matters more than diplomacy. Preston's eyes moved over Hayes, the gray pullover, the worn work pants, the absence of anything that registered as significant, and something shifted in his expression. Not anger, exactly. More like a recalibration. A man like Preston did not operate by the same set of social rules with everyone in a room. He made rapid assessments, assigned categories, and adjusted his behavior accordingly. Hayes had just been assigned a category, and the category did not come with much deference attached to it. "I think you need to be more careful about where you set things," Preston said louder this time, with the slight projection of someone who has decided the people around him should hear this. "In a place like this, you've got to be aware of your surroundings. Some of us have meetings to get to." Hayes looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Lily, who had gone very still in her seat, watching the exchange with the careful attention of someone who has learned to read adult tension before it announces itself. He turned back to Preston. "We're going to go," Hayes said. He began gathering what was left of their things, folding the wet napkins, picking up Lily's backpack from the floor where it had fallen in the commotion. That should have been the end of it. Preston should have turned back to the counter, collected his coffee, and gone about his morning. Most people would have. The situation had a natural exit, and both parties were approaching it. But there was something about Hayes's composure that worked on Preston the wrong way. The absence of scrambling, the absence of apology, the absence of the particular kind of grateful retreat that Preston was accustomed to receiving when he spoke to people in that tone. And so Preston didn't step aside to let them pass. He stayed where he was, his body blocking the narrow corridor between the table and the neighboring chairs, and the decision was so automatic, he probably wasn't fully aware he'd made it. "I'm not done talking to you," Preston said. Hayes looked at the space Preston was occupying. Then he looked back at Preston's face. "We're leaving," he said, the same even register, no escalation in it, no invitation for further exchange. "You haven't apologized," Preston said. "You made a scene. My suit could have been ruined." He said it with the absolute confidence of a man who believed the logic was sound, who had constructed a version of events in the past 30 seconds in which the fault was clear and the appropriate response was obvious. Around them, the cafe had begun to quiet in the particular way spaces quiet when something is happening that everyone can sense, but nobody wants to be the one to name. Hayes said nothing. He stood with Lily's backpack in his hand, waiting for the man to move, offering nothing that could be used as fuel. Preston didn't move. Instead, he took his phone out and held it up, not pointing it at Hayes, just holding it visibly, and said, "You know what? I think I should make a call. I know people at the city's family services division. Single father, unstable situation." He glanced briefly across the table and back at Hayes. A responsible department would want to know about this kind of environment. The temperature in Hayes's eyes changed. Not dramatically. It was not rage. Rage looked nothing like this. It was the specific shift of a man who has been operating on one set of rules and has just been handed a reason to consider a different set entirely. His jaw set. The hand holding the backpack stayed still. Everything about him stayed still, but the quality of the stillness was no longer the same quality it had been 30 seconds ago. Something had moved underneath it, the way pressure moves beneath the surface of something before the surface changes. Audrey Sinclair across the cafe set her cup down very slowly. She was no longer watching the room in general. She was watching Hayes Gallagher specifically, with the focused attention of someone who has recognized something they didn't expect to find, and is now watching carefully to see if the recognition holds. Hayes looked at Preston for a long moment. The math was simple and brutal. There was a threat to the one thing he had organized his entire life around protecting, and there was a man between him and the door who had just decided this was a game worth escalating without any understanding of what he was escalating into. Hayes had spent years learning the difference between situations that required patience and situations that required something else. He had not yet reached the second kind, but the distance between the two was no longer as wide as it had been 30 seconds ago. "Move," Hayes said. One word, the same level tone, but something had arrived underneath it that had not been there before, a weight, a texture, a register that belonged in a very different kind of room than this cafe on Michigan Avenue. Preston heard it. He registered something in the word even if he couldn't name it, and for a fraction of a second, his posture shifted. Then his face closed back over, because men like Preston do not back down in public in front of rooms full of people. To do so would require acknowledging that he had read the situation incorrectly, and that was not something his version of himself was built to accommodate. He didn't move. He put his phone to his ear instead. And so the morning continued, but it was no longer the morning Hayes Gallagher had planned, and somewhere in the corner booth, Audrey Sinclair had stopped thinking about her 8:30 meeting entirely. Preston made the call, but it wasn't to family services. It was to someone in the lobby of the building 2 blocks north, because 30 seconds later, the door to Meridian opened, and 2 men walked in who had not come for coffee. They were large in the way that suggested function over vanity, wide through the shoulders, thick-necked, wearing the kind of dark jackets that said corporate security without saying it out loud. They moved directly to Preston, flanked him without being asked, and turned to face Hayes with the flat professional attention of men who had done this kind of thing before and expected it to resolve quickly. They had the look of people for whom most situations resolved quickly, because most people, when faced with 2 men of that size moving toward them with that expression, made a rapid calculation and chose the easier outcome. The cafe, which had already been quiet, went quieter. The woman in finance stopped talking mid-sentence, her croissant forgotten on the plate. The young couple near the window had stopped pretending to read entirely and were now simply watching openly, the way people watch when something has crossed the threshold from awkward to something they will describe to other people later. Nobody reached for their phone, or if they did, they held it uncertainly, not sure yet what they were witnessing, and not sure they wanted to be documented as having watched it. Preston straightened when his men arrived the way a man straightens when the room has shifted back in his favor and he can afford to take up more space again. "You see," he said to Hayes, in the tone of someone explaining something obvious to someone slow, "this is how it works. You caused a disruption. You refused to take responsibility, and now you're making it worse by not walking yourself out." He gestured loosely at the 2 men beside him, almost casually, the way a man gestures at furniture that is doing exactly what furniture is supposed to do. "These gentlemen are going to help you understand the exit." Hayes hadn't moved. He was still standing with Lily's backpack in his hand, his body angled slightly, his weight distributed in a way that looked like stillness, but was not quite stillness. The difference between a person standing at rest and a person standing at ready, which is a difference most people never learn to see. His eyes had moved over the 2 men when they entered a single efficient scan that took in height-weight, dominant hand footwear, and the specific way each of them carried their center of gravity, and then returned to Preston. "Tell them to step back," Hayes said. His voice was the same register it had been for the past several minutes, even, dry, completely without theater. Preston laughed a short sound, with no actual amusement in it, the laugh of a man performing confidence for an audience. Or what? He looked at Hayes's clothes, at the worn edges of the backpack strap at the table, with the dried coffee rings spreading across it. "You gonna call your lawyer, file a complaint?" He spread his hands. I know the deputy commissioner of this city's child welfare office personally. I made one call, and I can make another. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to apologize in front of everyone in this room, or I'm going to make the kind of problems for you that don't go away." The words landed in the room and sat there heavy and deliberate, designed to be heard by everyone present. A few people looked away. The barista behind the counter had gone very still, pretending to wipe the espresso machine with a focus that the espresso machine had never previously demanded. The cafe manager, a man in his early 30s who had appeared from the back office sometime in the last few minutes, drawn by the change in the room's atmosphere, the way managers are drawn by anything that threatens to become a liability, stood near the counter with his arms crossed. The expression on his face was not outrage at what was being said. It was the expression of a man calculating how much damage a scene like this could do to a Tuesday morning, and hoping the problem would remove itself before he had to make a decision he didn't want to make. He looked once at Hayes and gave a small, almost apologetic tilt of his head toward the door. The message was clear, and it was cowardly, and he knew it was both. It wasn't about right or wrong, it was about disruption, and Hayes was now the disruption, regardless of how the disruption had started. So Hayes stood in the middle of Meridian Coffee, with 3 men in front of him, a manager who had quietly assigned the blame to the wrong person, and a room full of people who were watching from the careful distance of people who would feel guilty about this later, but were not yet ready to do anything about it. Now, he had Lily behind him, and a threat hanging in the air that had nothing to do with the 2 men in dark jackets, and everything to do with the one word Preston had deployed custody, and what would happen to his life if that word entered any official system with his name attached to it. He had built everything since his wife died on the single foundation of keeping Lily's world stable. Every decision, every trade-off, every morning at this cafe, all of it organized around one thing, and Preston had just aimed directly at that thing with the careless accuracy of someone who didn't know what he was shooting at, but could see it mattered. This was the calculation Hayes ran, not the physical one that one had resolved itself in his mind, already mechanically and without drama, the way a carpenter looks at a warped board and knows exactly what it will take to straighten it. The calculation he was running was the one that came after what walking out of here, looking like a man who had been pushed out, would cost him in the legal and social landscape of a city where Preston Mercer apparently knew deputy commissioners by their first names. Whether compliance now would invite more of the same, whether the man in front of him was the kind of person who stopped when given what he asked for, or the kind who treated compliance as confirmation that asking harder had always been the right strategy. He set Lily's backpack down on the chair beside him. Slowly, deliberately, the movement of a man who has made a decision and is no longer in a hurry about it. And he looked at Preston with the specific quality of attention that the 2 men in dark jackets registered before Preston did, because men in that profession develop a sensitivity to certain kinds of attention, a calibration built from years of reading rooms, and both of them shifted their weight almost simultaneously without meaning to. It was involuntary. It was the body responding to information the mind hadn't fully processed yet. "I'm going to say this once," Hayes said. "Take the threat about my daughter off the table. Whatever else you want to do here, that part is finished." Preston heard something in the sentence, the same thing he'd heard in the single word, "move," a few minutes earlier, that subsonic register that didn't belong in a Tuesday morning argument about spilled coffee. His chin came up, which was what Preston did when he was uncertain, and didn't want it to show a posture he had probably developed sometime in his 20s and never examined since. "You don't make conditions," Preston said, but the volume was slightly lower than his previous sentences. Fractionally, enough to notice if you were paying attention, and Audrey Sinclair was paying attention. One of the 2 men in dark jackets, the one on the left, broader than his partner, with a flat nose that had been broken at least once and reset imperfectly, leaned half an inch toward his colleague. It was an involuntary adjustment, a body communicating something to another body in the language that precedes words. Hayes saw it. Audrey Sinclair from her corner booth saw it too, and her eyes moved from the two men back to Hayes, with an expression that had shifted from assessment to something closer to recognition. "You were a cop," she said to herself quietly, "not intended for anyone." Then she answered her own question almost immediately, because it wasn't cop. She had spent enough time around law enforcement to know what cop looked like. This was something else. Something that had been trained in environments where the margin for error was smaller and the consequences of miscalculation were permanent. Preston took a step forward. The two men took a step forward with him, the movement coordinated in the way of people who have done this together before. The space between them and Hayes was now approximately 4 feet, which in most confrontations is the moment when the social architecture of the situation collapses and something more physical takes over. Hayes registered the distance the same way he'd registered their weight shift, their footwear, the angle of their approach. Every variable in the space had been inside his awareness since the moment the two men walked through the door, cataloged and filed without visible effort, the way certain skills become so internalized they stop requiring conscious allocation. "You want to walk out of here with whatever dignity you think you have left," Preston said. "You get on your knees and you apologize. To me and to everyone in this room, you've disrupted this morning." He said it with the flat finality of a man announcing terms he considers already accepted. "Otherwise, I promise you, and I keep my promises, your daughter will be in a foster placement by the end of the week." The sentence finished. The room held it. And something in Hayes that had been maintained at a careful, trained, deliberate distance for the entirety of this exchange moved. Not broke. Hayes Gallagher was not a man who broke under pressure, not anymore. Not after the years and the losses and the specific process of being rebuilt into someone that pressure could not reach in the ordinary sense. But there is a place in every man where the professional and the personal stop being separate things, and Preston had just found it with the precision of someone who had no idea what he was reaching into or what lived there. Hayes's breathing pattern didn't change. His hands stayed loose at his sides. His face did not do what most faces do when pushed past a threshold. It did not flush, did not tighten, did not arrange itself into the warning signs that humans have evolved to read as the precursor to action. It went very, very calm. The kind of calm that is not the absence of something, but the presence of something else, entirely the focused, deliberate stillness of a person who is no longer deciding whether to act, but is instead deciding precisely how and how much and where. This was the thing Audrey Sinclair had been trying to name since he walked through the door of Meridian. She had seen boardroom aggression and the aggression of money and lawyers and leverage applied at scale. She had seen men perform toughness in conference rooms and across negotiating tables. This was none of those things. This was trained, operational. The calm of someone who had spent years in environments where losing control of your emotional state was not a social liability, but a survival one. Preston pointed a finger at the floor in front of him. "Kneel," he said. The two men moved. The one on the left came in first. A shoulder-first movement, heavy and direct, the approach of someone who expected his size to end the conversation before it became a conversation. Hayes sidestepped with an economy of motion that looked almost incidental, like a man shifting to avoid something falling, and redirected the momentum with a single contact point at the man's forearm that sent him into the neighboring table with enough controlled force to scatter cups and tip 2 chairs. It happened in the span of a breath. No wind-up, no announcement, no wasted movement. Nothing that looked like fighting. It looked more like physics, like Hayes had simply understood how the man's momentum worked and declined to be where it was going. The second man registered what had happened and adjusted his approach. He came in lower, more careful arms reaching for a grip rather than a push, the instinct of someone switching tactics mid-engagement. Hayes let him get one hand on his jacket, then used that grip as the fulcrum of a precise leverage technique that required understanding exactly how a human shoulder joint was constructed and exactly how much rotational force it could tolerate before it stopped tolerating. The man went down on one knee with a sharp, controlled sound of pain, and Hayes stepped back and released him cleanly. No follow-through, no excess. All of it had taken approximately 4 seconds. Preston stood alone. The two men were on the floor, one holding his shoulder, with the expression of someone taking a private inventory of damage, one pushing himself up from the overturned table with the stunned look of someone whose body had just done something he had not agreed to. Preston looked at Hayes, and for the first time in the entirety of the morning, something crossed his face that had not been there before. Not fear, exactly. Fear would come later in a quieter room. What crossed his face now was the specific blankness of a man whose model of a situation has just been invalidated so completely that he has not yet assembled a replacement. Hayes hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't thrown a single punch. He had simply made the room match what had been true about him since he walked through the door, and the room had complied. He straightened his gray pullover, picked up Lily's backpack from the chair, and looked at Preston with an expression that contained no anger, no triumph, and no residual adrenaline, because there was no residual adrenaline. That was the part that was hardest to look at directly. Outside, audible through the glass front of Meridian, a police siren rose from somewhere to the south and grew closer, then another from a different direction converging. The sound filled the café the way a change in weather fills a space gradually and then completely. Hayes heard it. His eyes moved to the window, then back to the room, the two men on the floor. Preston with his back against the counter, the manager frozen near the office door. The dozens of witnesses who had just watched a simply dressed man dismantle 2 trained security professionals in 4 seconds while standing next to a coffee spill. He understood immediately what this scene would look like to officers walking through that door. He understood the math of it. With the same mechanical clarity, he understood everything else, and the math was not in his favor. Not in the 30-second version of events that would be assembled in the first minutes of a police response, where the man standing and uninjured in the center of a room with 2 people on the floor was almost always the answer to the question before the question was fully asked. Preston understood the same math, and a slow recovering expression had begun to rearrange his face. Not confidence yet. Confidence would take another moment. But the beginnings of it. The recalculation of a man who has just realized that the outcome he wanted might still be achievable just through a different mechanism than the one he'd planned. Hayes stood very still and looked at the door, and for the first time in the entire morning, he did not look like a man who had everything under control. He looked like a man holding something that was about to be taken from him, and knowing it, and not knowing yet what to do about it. The siren stopped outside Meridian. 2 officers came through the door of Meridian with the particular controlled urgency of people who have been told there is a physical altercation in progress and have arrived to find the altercation already over. They swept the room in a single practiced look. 2 men on the floor, one holding his shoulder, one still righting himself against the overturned table. A 3rd man standing at the counter with the careful stillness of someone who has just decided to become a victim. And then their eyes landed on Hayes, who was standing in the center of all of it, with a backpack in his hand and no visible injury, which in the shorthand of first response told its own story, regardless of how the story had actually gone. The senior officer, broad mid-40s name tag reading Dolan, moved toward Hayes with one hand, raised in the universal gesture that means stay exactly where you are. His partner moved to the 2 men on the floor. The café was absolutely silent. Nobody was pretending to do anything else anymore. The performance of the morning, the briefs, the croissants, the careful positioning had all been set aside. Everyone was simply watching. "Sir, I need you to set the bag down and keep your hands where I can see them, Officer Dolan said. His voice was professional, flat calibrated, the voice of a man who had learned not to assign guilt in the first 30 seconds, but whose body language assigned it anyway, because the geometry of the room pointed in one direction, and geometry was hard to argue with. Hayes set the backpack on the chair beside him. He raised both hands to shoulder height, open palms forward. He did it without being told twice, and without any of the performance of innocence that guilty people sometimes produce. No wide eyes, no rapid explanation, no verbal rush to fill the silence before the silence could be filled by something worse. He simply complied and waited, and the quality of his waiting had the same trained patience as everything else he had done that morning. He was not fidgeting. He was not scanning the room for exits. He was standing in place with his hands visible and letting the situation develop at its own pace, because he had learned a long time ago that the worst thing a person can do in a fluid situation is accelerate it in a direction they don't control. Preston had found his footing by then. The blank uncertainty that had crossed his face when Hayes put his two men on the floor had mostly resolved itself, replaced by something that looked like composure, but was actually the rapid assembly of a narrative, the thing Preston did professionally, the construction of a version of events that served a particular outcome. He straightened his jacket, touched his cufflinks once, and addressed Officer Dolan directly, in the tone of a man accustomed to being the most credible person in any room a police officer was also occupying. "I'm Preston Mercer, director at Apex Equities," he said. "This man attacked my associates without provocation. He was asked to leave the premises and he refused, and when my colleagues attempted to assist the manager in removing him, he assaulted both of them." He gestured broadly at the room. "I have a room full of witnesses." Several people who had been staring found reasons to look elsewhere when Preston's gesture swept over them. Officer Dolan looked at Hayes. "That accurate?" Hayes looked back at him. "No," he said. One word. Offered without elaboration or urgency, the way a man answers, when he is confident the full version of events will hold and does not feel the need to preemptively defend it. Dolan's partner had crouched beside the man with the injured shoulder and was asking him questions in a low voice. The conversation was short. The associate's answers were brief, and from what could be heard across the café, increasingly non-committal, the recalibration of a man who has assessed the situation and is no longer certain that his employer's version of it is the one he wants to be formally attached to. The other associate had gotten fully upright and was standing with his arms crossed in the manner of someone who was trying to look like he chose to be standing and not like the floor returned him. The manager near the office door had the expression of a man who deeply wished he had stayed in the back office and was now going to spend the rest of the day wishing it. It was at this moment that Audrey Sinclair stood up. She did it without drama. She rose from the corner booth, smoothed the front of her blazer with one hand, and walked toward Officer Dolan with the unhurried gait of someone who has decided to enter a situation and has no concern about how her entrance will land. She was not loud. She did not wave her hand or raise her voice. She simply arrived at Dolan's elbow and spoke at a volume that carried across the silent café without needing to be raised. "Officer, my name is Audrey Sinclair. I was seated in that booth from before any of this began." She indicated the corner booth with a small, precise gesture. "I observed the entirety of what happened from the initial incident to this moment. If you need a witness account, I'm available to give one." Dolan looked at her. His expression shifted slightly, not because of her clothes or her composure, though both registered in the way things register with experienced officers, but because of the specific manner in which she had spoken. It was the manner of someone who understood the weight of an official statement and was not concerned by it. Someone who had given formal accounts before and knew exactly what they were agreeing to. "And what did you observe, ma'am?" Audrey told him. She did it in the manner of a woman who had spent a career presenting complex information to rooms full of skeptical people, clear sequencing, No editorializing. No loaded language, specific observable details offered in the order they occurred. She described Preston entering the cafe while on a call. She described the spilled coffee, the refusal to acknowledge fault, the immediate assignment of blame to Hayes. She described the escalating language, the deliberate public humiliation, and the explicit threat regarding family services and custody. She used the word explicit, and she used it accurately. She described the two men arriving and flanking Hayes. She described Hayes's repeated verbal attempts to leave and Preston's physical positioning to prevent it. She described what she had witnessed in the 4 seconds that followed Preston's final command, and she described it as what it was, a man responding to physical contact, initiated by 2 others, in a space he had been actively prevented from leaving. Preston's jaw had tightened progressively through Audrey's account, the way a structure tightens when load is applied to points it wasn't designed to support. When she finished, he said, "I don't know who you are, but you're describing a version of events that—" "My name is Audrey Sinclair," she said, again turning to face him directly for the first time since rising from the booth. She said it with the same even tone she had used with Officer Dolan. No elevation, no theater. Sinclair Capital Group. We finalized the acquisition of Apex Equities at 11:59 last night, which means, as of this morning, your firm belongs to my organization. She held his gaze. And as of this moment, you are no longer employed there. The room received this in total silence. The particular silence of people who have just witnessed a second, entirely unexpected reversal in the space of 5 minutes. Preston stared at her. The expression on his face moved through several stages, in rapid succession: disbelief, the instinct to dispute a reaching for the kind of authority he had been wielding all morning, and found nothing to close around. His mouth opened. He said, "That's the announcement isn't until—" "The announcement is a formality," Audrey said. "The transaction closed last night. You can verify that with your own legal team. I would recommend doing so promptly." She held his gaze for exactly 1 more second, the second required to make clear that the conversation was finished and not paused, and then turned back to Officer Dolan as though Preston had already left the building. Dolan had been a police officer for 19 years. He had learned to read rooms the way experienced navigators read water, not by the surface, but by what was moving underneath it. He looked at the 2 men on the floor, one of whom was now quietly declining medical attention with the subdued manner of someone whose certainty about the situation had significantly eroded. He looked at Preston, who was staring at his phone with the mechanical concentration of a man searching his contacts for something that can undo the last 30 seconds. He looked at Hayes, who had kept his hands at shoulder height throughout the entirety of Audrey's account, without once attempting to add to it, correct it, or insert himself into it. And he looked at Audrey, who was waiting with the grounded attention of someone who has said what needed to be said and has nothing further to offer unless asked. Dolan lowered his notepad. "Mr. Gallagher." He said Hayes had given his name when first asked quietly and without hesitation, the reflex of someone who has never had a reason to be reluctant about it. "You're free to go. I may need contact information for a follow-up." Hayes gave it. He gave it in the same unhurried way he had done everything else that morning, and then he picked up Lily's backpack from the chair and turned toward the door. Preston said, "This isn't over." To no one in particular, his attention still divided between the room and the phone in his hand. It was the kind of sentence men say when everything is in fact over, and the saying of it is the only remaining action available. Nobody responded. Not Dolan. Not Audrey. Not anyone in the cafe, which had settled back into the careful quiet of people who had witnessed something significant and were now in the private process of deciding what to make of it. Hayes reached the door and pushed it open and stepped out into the morning on Michigan Avenue, which was exactly as it had been an hour earlier, loud cold at the edges, traffic moving in both directions, without any awareness of or interest in what had happened inside one coffee shop on its corner. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment with the backpack over one shoulder and the cold air moving across his face. Then he started walking. He had gone half a block when he heard footsteps behind him, quick, purposeful, not attempting to be quiet. His awareness shifted in the automatic way it always did when someone approached from behind at pace. He turned at the corner. Audrey Sinclair stopped a few feet away. She had her coat on now, charcoal wool over the blazer, buttoned against the wind, and she was looking at him with the same direct, evaluating attention she had been directing at him since he walked into Meridian, except that now there was no peripheral quality to it. No pretense that she was looking at anything else. "You were special operations," she said. It was not a question. Hayes looked at her. "I did some work for the government," he said. "A while ago." Audrey accepted this the way she accepted most incomplete answers as data, as a shape that told her something, even if it didn't tell her everything. "How long have you been out?" 4 years. She nodded once, the nod of someone filing a number that confirms a calculation. The wind moved down Michigan Avenue between them. A cab went past, and the sound of it briefly filled the space before she spoke again. "I need someone to run security for me," she said. "Not the kind that stands near an elevator and looks large. I've had 3 of those, and they were useless for anything that actually mattered. I mean real security threat assessment, advanced logistics, close protection for international travel management of a small team." She said it the way she said everything, without softening, without preamble, as though the shortest distance between 2 points was the only route she was willing to take. "The position has been open for 8 months because the person I need is specific, and I haven't been willing to settle." Hayes said nothing. She had already learned that his silence was not the same thing as refusal. "I watched you conduct a full threat assessment on that room in the first 10 seconds after you walked through the door," she said. "I watched you absorb 20 minutes of deliberate escalation without surrendering control of a single variable in that space. And when you did act, it was precise, proportional, and complete. You didn't take a swing. You didn't lose your temper. You didn't do anything that wasn't necessary." She held his gaze steadily. "That is not something you learn in a weekend certification course. The salary is $220,000 annually, with a full benefit structure, housing assistance, if relocation becomes relevant, and contractual terms that are built around protecting your personal commitments." A brief, deliberate beat. "Including your daughter's school schedule." The last sentence was not accidental. Audrey Sinclair did not say things by accident. Hayes looked down at the sidewalk for a moment, then back at her. In the years since leaving the military, since the transition that had felt less like a new beginning than a long process of determining what was left, after everything that defined you has been removed. He had kept his life deliberately contained. The construction job, the apartment, the Tuesday mornings at Meridian. Not from lack of ambition, but because containment had been the only structure large enough to hold what needed. Holding the grief, the vigilance, the daily discipline of being present enough that Lily had something solid to build her sense of stability on. He had been good at it. He had been reliable at it. But reliable and complete were not the same thing. And he had known for some time that the container was going to need to change. "I'd need to talk to a lawyer before I signed anything," he said. Audrey reached into her coat pocket and produced a card, matte black name, and direct number, only no title, no company logo, and held it out. "Take the week," she said. "I won't be in Chicago past Friday. The offer doesn't expire when I leave." Hayes took the card. He looked at it for a moment and put it in the pocket of his gray pullover. Audrey turned to go. She had taken 2 steps when she stopped, not turning back, addressing the middle distance of Michigan Avenue, with the tone of someone saying something they had decided to say and were not inviting a response to. "For what it's worth, what you did in there. Not the 4 seconds at the end, the 20 minutes before it. That was the harder thing." She didn't wait. She walked back toward the café and the city absorbed her. And Hayes stood alone on the corner with the card in his pocket, and the sound of Chicago moving around him in every direction. 6 months later, Hayes Gallagher sat in the corner of a conference room on the 41st floor of a building in Geneva, the kind of room where the air felt processed and deliberate, and the view of the city below was so precise, it looked like a rendering. He was wearing a dark suit that fit correctly an earpiece that was invisible unless you knew where to look, and the same expression he had worn in Meridian on a Tuesday morning, attentive, contained present to every variable in the space. 3 members of his team were positioned at intervals around the perimeter of the room. He had selected each of them personally over the course of 6 weeks from a list of candidates that had originally contained 47 names. Across the room, Audrey Sinclair was concluding a meeting with a delegation that had arrived from 4 different countries. She spoke without notes. She did not raise her voice to hold the room's attention because she had never needed to. At one point, she glanced across to where Hayes stood, the brief, specific glance of a person confirming that something they have counted on is where they expected it to be. He gave her a small nod. She returned to the meeting without breaking stride. Preston Mercer had been formally separated from Apex Equities within 48 hours of the acquisition closing, following a preliminary internal review of his expense records and communications. The process was methodical, legally airtight, and entirely without drama. He retained 2 attorneys to contest his termination, and was advised by both that the documentation made any challenge inadvisable. He was no longer in finance. He was no longer in Chicago. The city had moved on in the efficient, indifferent way that cities move on without ceremony and without looking back. Lily Gallagher was enrolled in a school on the north side with a strong arts program and a student-to-teacher ratio that Hayes had spent 2 weeks researching before committing to the decision. She had her own room for the first time in 3 years. On Tuesday mornings when Hayes was in the city, they still went for coffee, not Meridian, but a smaller place 3 blocks from their apartment, with mismatched chairs and a barista who had their order ready before they reached the counter. Hayes did not think often about the morning at Meridian. When he did, it was not the 4 seconds that came back to him. It was the moment before, standing in the middle of that cafe with his hands open and everything he had built at sudden visible risk, and the understanding that had settled into him in that moment, with the weight of something he had always known but never had confirmed so directly, that the life he had constructed in the years since leaving the military was not the minimum version of himself he could manage. It was the foundation. It had always been the foundation. It had simply been waiting for the right conditions to become what it was actually capable of supporting. He had found the conditions. He had done the work. And on a Tuesday morning in Chicago in a coffee shop on Michigan Avenue, the rest of it had simply begun.